Corpus Christi is a victim not because of lack of water, they're a victim because of a lack of ability to make a decision.
Corpus Christi, one of Texas's largest cities, is heading for a water crisis, leaving residents. The water situation in South Texas is about as dire as I've ever seen it. It has all the energy in the world, and it doesn't have water.
Texas is watching one of its most alarming water crises unfold in real time. A major reservoir system tied to Corpus Christi has dropped to critically low levels, and now hundreds of thousands of people are staring at a future no city ever wants to imagine. What happens when the water simply runs out? As of March 24, 2026, Corpus Christi's combined storage in Lake Corpus Christi and Choke Canyon Reservoir was just 8.3%, while Lake Corpus Christi alone was about 9.1% full. City and state documents also describe the system as serving roughly 500,000 residents across the region. This is not a distant warning anymore. This is not a someday problem. This is a real American city, right now, trying to hold the line while reservoirs shrink, restrictions tighten, and officials scramble for emergency supply options like groundwater wells, Lake Texana transfers, and desalination planning. And the most unsettling part? When a city starts talking this openly about backup wells, curtailments, and long-term emergency supply, it means the clock is no longer hypothetical. It is already ticking. If you look at the Texas coast on a map, Corpus Christi seems like the last place that should be facing this kind of crisis. It sits near bays, rivers, industry. It looks connected to water from every direction. But modern cities do not survive on geography alone. They survive on systems, reservoirs, pipelines, treatment plants, river flows, permits, pumping rights, and long-range planning. And when those systems come under extreme stress, the illusion of abundance can disappear fast. That is what makes this story so gripping. Because this is not just about a lake getting lower. It is about what happens when an entire regional water network begins approaching its limits at the same time a major metropolitan and industrial service area still needs every drop it can get. The city of Corpus Christi says it provides water and wastewater service to about 500,000 residents and supplies water in a 7-county service area. And now, with reservoir levels near historic lows, every decision carries more weight. Every forecast matters more. Every week without significant recovery becomes harder to ignore. The numbers that changed the mood. For a long time, drought can feel abstract. People hear percentages, they hear officials talk about conservation, they hear words like stage 1, stage 2, or contingency planning. But eventually, a number appears that changes the emotional tone of the entire story. For Corpus Christi, that number is 8.3%. That is the combined storage level the city reported for Lake Corpus Christi and Choke Canyon Reservoir on March 24, 2026. And on the same date range, water data for Texas showed Lake Corpus Christi itself at roughly 9.1% full. Choke Canyon was also in single digits on the regional dashboard. At that point, this is no longer a story about inconvenience. It becomes a story about endurance and pressure, and the possibility that a city could eventually face limits so severe that the phrase water shutdown stops sounding like a dramatic headline and starts sounding like a scenario planners are desperate to avoid. The city is already in stage 3 drought status, an urgent level on its own public-facing dashboard. That means the crisis is not hidden inside reports or buried in technical documents. It is right there in public view. That visibility matters, because once a city starts openly signaling urgency, the public understands something simple and frightening. There is no comfortable buffer left. Why a coastal city can still run short. To people outside Texas, this can sound confusing. How does a coastal city get this close to running dry? The answer is that cities do not drink ocean water directly. They depend on managed freshwater systems, and in the coastal bend, much of the region's supply has long depended on the Choke Canyon, Lake Corpus Christi, Lake Texana, Mary Roads pipeline network, and related regional infrastructure. State planning documents describe these surface water systems as the backbone of supply in Region N, with the city of Corpus Christi acting as the region's largest water supplier. So when the reservoirs tied to that system drop hard, the risk is not symbolic, it is structural. This is what water stress looks like in the real world. Not one dramatic moment, not a single cracked riverbed on camera, but a chain reaction inside the supply network itself. Less storage, less flexibility, tighter restrictions, harder choices. And as those choices get harder, the conversation shifts. It is no longer, how do we use water wisely? It becomes, how do we keep enough water moving through the system at all? That is a very different question, and it is a much more serious one. Corpus Christi's quietly brutal reality. One reason this story hits so hard is because it does not feel cinematic at first. There is no giant siren, no countdown clock in the street, no dramatic announcement saying the taps will stop tomorrow. Instead, the crisis unfolds in the language of water management. Combined storage levels, curtailments, well field testing, permit updates, drought stages, and weekly briefings. But that quiet language hides a brutal reality. The city has recently announced weekly media briefings on water supply initiatives, said it has begun test pumping on wells in its western well field, and reported developments tied to Lake Texana curtailment and a bed and banks permit. It has also authorized exploration of seawater desalination options at the Barney Davis power plant. Those are not the moves of a city treating this as routine. Those are the moves of a city building every backup path it can. And when you list them together, reservoir crisis, emergency groundwater development, transfer efforts, desalination exploration, the pattern becomes impossible to miss. Corpus Christi is not waiting for the problem to solve itself. It is actively trying to outrun it. The fear behind the faucet. Most people do not think about water until the moment they need it. You wake up, you brush your teeth, you shower, you wash dishes, you fill a glass, you run a business, you cool equipment, you clean a hospital room, you cook at a restaurant, you fight a fire. Water is so woven into normal life that the idea of interruption feels almost unbelievable, until a city enters a genuine supply scare. That is why the words "runs dry" land so hard. Not because everyone in Corpus Christi has already lost water, but because once a metropolitan region starts moving deeper into drought emergency mode, people begin imagining the unthinkable. What if the restrictions get tighter? What if the backup supplies come in too slowly? What if summer heat arrives before the system recovers? What if the worst-case planning language becomes operational reality? That fear is powerful because it is not just about thirst. It is about the collapse of normal daily confidence. A city can survive a lot, but when people begin wondering whether water will still be there when they turn the handle, that uncertainty reaches into every part of life. The 500,000 person pressure point. The number 500,000 matters because it changes the scale of the story. This is not an isolated rural outpost with one shrinking reservoir and a few thousand connections. Official Texas Water Development Board materials say the city provides water and wastewater services to approximately 500,000 residents and serves a broad regional system, including municipal and industrial customers. That means the stakes spread far beyond one neighborhood. Homes depend on this system. Schools depend on it. Hospitals depend on it. Industry depend on it. Emergency response depends on it. And the broader coastal bend economy depends on confidence that water will continue to move where it needs to go. That is why water crises in major service areas feel different from smaller local shortages. Because once the service population climbs high enough, the water story becomes a public health story, an economic story, a political story, and an infrastructure story all at once. And that is exactly where Corpus Christi is now. How reservoirs become a warning. There is something psychologically shocking about seeing a reservoir percentage in single digits. When a lake is half full, people still imagine recovery. When it is a quarter full, they worry. But when it drops toward 10% or below, the language changes. The lake is no longer low. It starts to feel wounded, exposed, fragile. Lake Corpus Christi's reported storage around 9.1% full is the kind of number that transforms a map into a warning. The city's combined reservoir figure of 8.3% makes the message even starker. And once the public sees that, the imagination does the rest. People picture shorelines pulled back, boat ramps useless, water intakes under stress, mud where open water used to be. And behind all of those images is one deeper fear. If the lake looks this bad now, what happens next?
The backup plans tell the real story.
One of the clearest ways to measure the seriousness of a water crisis is not by the headlines. It is by the backup plans. When officials begin activating secondary sources, emergency permitting, additional wells, and desalination planning, they are effectively saying one thing without dramatics. The old margin of safety is gone. Corpus Christi Water has publicly discussed test pumping in the Western well field. The city has also discussed Lake Texana curtailment issues, securing a bed and banks permit, and studying seawater desalination options. Each one of those actions matters. Together, they paint a picture of a city pulling from every possible lever: groundwater, transfers, regulatory flexibility, future desal, public communication. That does not mean collapse is guaranteed, but it does mean the normal supply picture is no longer enough. And when normal is no longer enough, people start understanding how close a system may be to the edge. Why this feels bigger than one city. Stories like this travel fast because they trigger a larger fear people already carry. If it can happen there, where else can it happen? That question is what turns a regional drought crisis into a national conversation. Because Corpus Christi is not the only growing place wrestling with water limits. Across the American South and West, cities are trying to balance population, industry, aging infrastructure, climate variability, and finite supplies. The coastal bend's predicament becomes a symbol of that wider pressure. Even places with complex regional systems can reach a point where emergency measures become central, not peripheral. And there is something haunting about that. Modern cities often look permanent, stable, engineered, too big to fail in basic ways. But water has a way of exposing the truth. No city is stronger than its supply. No growth plan is more real than the water behind it. And no technology fully protects a region that waits too long to prepare.
The human side, no one can ignore. Behind every reservoir chart is a household. Behind every conservation order is a family. Behind every emergency briefing is someone asking a very basic question. Are we going to be okay? That question is what gives this story its emotional weight. Because for residents, this is not mainly about hydrology. It is about daily life under uncertainty. Do I water my yard? Probably not. Do I repair that leak today? Absolutely. Do I trust the officials? I hope so. Do I need to prepare for tighter restrictions? Probably. Do I need to think about what happens if this gets worse? Yes. That is how drought enters ordinary life. Not all at once, but piece by piece. One cancelled habit, one new rule, one headline, one warning, one look at the lake level, one conversation at dinner. And eventually, the crisis is no longer happening somewhere out there in the system. It is happening in your kitchen. The phrase total water shutdown. Now let's address the phrase that grabs attention most. Total water shutdown. It is a dramatic phrase, and for good reason. Because even if it is not the current operating reality, it represents the nightmare endpoint of a failed water system, when supply can no longer meet essential need and emergency measures are exhausted. What makes that phrase feel less like clickbait and more like a genuine fear is the context around it. Stage 3 drought status, combined storage near 8.3%, active search for alternative supplies, and ongoing city communication focused on securing long-term water availability. In other words, shutdown is not today's headline as an official action, but avoidance of catastrophic shortage is clearly part of why all of this emergency planning exists. That distinction matters, because the real story is not the water stopped. The real story is that officials are fighting hard to make sure it never does. And when you understand that, the urgency becomes even more real.
The title versus the truth. There is one more thing worth saying clearly. A dramatic title may frame this as Texas's biggest lake, but the actual crisis here centers on the reservoirs and regional water systems serving Corpus Christi, especially Lake Corpus Christi and Choke Canyon. Not a single, simple superlative. What is beyond debate is how low the storage numbers are and how seriously officials are treating them. And honestly, the real situation is dramatic enough without exaggeration. Because when a major Texas coastal service area with around 500,000 residents is operating under urgent drought status and chasing multiple emergency supply strategies, you do not need inflated wording to make the point. The point makes itself. What happens next? That is the question hanging over everything. What happens next? Will meaningful rainfall arrive in time? Will transfers and permits buy enough breathing room? Will groundwater development scale fast enough? Will desalination planning become an actual lifeline? Or will the city be forced into even more painful restrictions as summer demand rises? Right now, the public record shows a city trying to expand options, increase communication, and manage a critically stressed system before it crosses into something worse. That is where the story stands today. Not at the end, not in collapse, but in a tense and narrowing middle where every week matters and every delay costs more. And sometimes that middle is the most dramatic part of all, because it is where a city learns whether its preparation will be enough. Conclusion. So here is the bigger truth behind the headline. Corpus Christi has not become a ghost city. Its taps have not all gone silent, but the warning signs are serious, public, and impossible to dismiss. Lake Corpus Christi has been sitting around 9.1% full, and the city's combined reservoir storage has been reported at just 8.3% as of March 24, 2026. Officials are moving on multiple fronts: wellfields, permits, transfers, public briefings, and desalination options, because they understand exactly what is at stake. This is what a modern water emergency looks like before the absolute breaking point. Quiet meetings, hard numbers, urgent dashboards, backup plans, public restraint, and a growing understanding that water, the most basic thing in daily life, is never guaranteed. That is why this story matters. Not just for Corpus Christi, not just for Texas, but for every city that believes size, money, or geography automatically protects it from scarcity. Because in the end, water does not care about headlines. It cares about supply. And when supply falls far enough, every city is forced to face the same terrifying question: how long do we really have?